Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to take a look at the life and crimes of Lorenzo Fayne.
Oh, a name that might not be familiar to everyone.
You got it, but his story, well, it's one that'll stick with you.
Definitely. We've got articles and court records here giving us a pretty in-depth look at this guy.
A complex figure, that's for sure, and we'll try to untangle it all. What really strikes me is that his case isn't just about, the horrible crimes.
Oh, absolutely not. It raises questions about the justice system itself,
Exactly.
childhood trauma,
Yeah.
even the very nature of evil. It's heavy stuff.
So let's start with the basics. Lorenzo Fayne was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1971.
Milwaukee in the 70s, not exactly a walk in the park.
No, not at all. And Fane's childhood, well, let's just say it was anything but idyllic.
We're talking poverty, neglect, even abuse mentioned in these reports.
All shaping his early years.
And it's crucial to understand this context.
Oh, absolutely.
It really shaped Fane's development.
Yeah, it's like laying the foundation.
You see a pattern of, escalating criminal behavior.
Starting young, too.
Way too young. Robbery, assault, landing him in juvenile detention.
Think about the impact of that environment, especially on a young mind.
Especially with what we know now about his borderline intellectual disability, that environment couldn't have been good.
No, not at all. Okay, so we set the stage a bit. But how does this kid go from juvenile offenses to, well, murder? Where did that dark path begin?
Well, the sources we have point to 1989 with the murder of a woman named Rita Scott in Milwaukee.
Brutal beating, right?
Absolutely brutal. And although it was never definitively pinned on him at the time, he's strongly suspected.
I see.
But his real, I guess you could say, reign of terror began when he moved to East St. Louis, Illinois, to live with his grandmother.
A change of scenery, but not a change in behavior, it seems.
Sadly, no.
So what happened in East St. Louis? This is where it gets really chilling, right?
Yeah, between 1989 and 1993,
Just a few years.
Fayne committed a series of murders, mostly targeting young girls and women in his neighborhood. It's a horrifying pattern.
The sources go into some of the details. 14-year-old Latondra Dean,
Raped and stabbed.
9-year-old Fallon Flood.
Same. Raped, then strangled.
It's just awful. And these weren't random acts either, were they?
No, not at all. There's a clear pattern here. The sexual violence, the vulnerability of the victims.
Yeah.
It's chilling.
There's one victim story that really stood out to me when I was reading these reports. 8-year-old Uri Hunt.
Oh, Ori's case is just heartbreaking.
Snatched while riding her bike. Just unimaginable.
And her murder became a turning point in the investigation.
How so?
The brutality, the age of the victim, it just shook the community. The pressure on the police was immense.
And they were already looking at Fayne, right?
They had their suspicions, but Uri's case intensified everything, and it led them to crucial forensic evidence.
Finally connecting him to the crimes.
Yeah, they had enough to bring him in.
So they finally had their man. What led to his actual arrest?
His final murder, it seems. 1993, 17-year-old Faith Davis, raped and stabbed in her apartment.
Another horrific crime.
But this time, there were witnesses who put Fayne at the scene.
Witnesses, they make all the difference.
In this case, they did. It sealed his fate.
The sources describe a confession spree after his arrest. It's almost like he was relieved to finally be caught.
You know, that's an interesting observation. Maybe a sense of relief, or maybe just the weight of it all finally crashing down.
He confessed to several murders, including Uri Hunt's, and his motivations, as he described them, were chilling.
Talk about disturbing. A desire for power, a need to compensate for his own feelings of inadequacy. It's a dark look into his psyche.
So we have this clear trajectory, traumatic childhood, a system that maybe failed him, a series of escalating crimes, and finally, a confession. You'd think that's it. Case closed, right?
You'd think so. Trials, convictions, maybe even death sentences. It seems straightforward, doesn't it?
Right. But then there's a twist in this story.
Oh, yeah. A big one.
Yeah.
And that's where we'll pick up next time. That twist, that's a whole other layer to this onion, isn't it?
It is. But before we get to that, I keep coming back to this question. What drove him, really? I mean, we have these pieces of his past, like you said.
Poverty, the abuse, yeah.
But is that enough to explain these horrific crimes? I'm not so sure.
It's tempting to just draw a straight line from trauma to violence like that.
Right, because not everyone who goes through those things ends up as a serial killer, obviously.
Exactly. There's this complex interplay of, nature and nurture.
And then you factor in his borderline intellectual disability.
Right.
Yeah.
How did that impact his decision-making? His ability to control his impulses, it's a big question.
I mean, it doesn't excuse anything he did, but I feel like it's got to be a part of the puzzle, doesn't it?
Well, for sure, it has to be considered. Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone with a borderline intellectual disability might struggle with certain things.
Like what?
Abstract thinking, understanding consequences, controlling those emotions. Compared to someone without those challenges, it's just a different playing field.
So we're looking at this combination of a traumatic upbringing, potential developmental challenges, and then this horrifying pattern of violence. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, for sure. And, in forensic psychology,
Mhm.
there are different schools of thought on all of this, how these things might interact. Some might look at social learning theory.
So he learned these behaviors.
The idea is that he learned them through observation and, his experiences,
Yeah.
maybe in his childhood, maybe even in juvenile detention. Scary to think about.
So it's not just nature versus nurture, it's also about the influence of his environment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Others might look at attachment theory.
Attachment theory.
Yeah. Exploring whether Fayne's early experiences, the neglect, the abuse,
The lack of those bonds.
exactly, whether those impacted his ability to form healthy relationships later on.
Oh, leading to a distorted view of intimacy and power, right?
That's the idea. But then there's the question of the specific nature of his crimes.
The sexual violence, the fact that he targeted vulnerable victims.
Right. And this is where it gets really complex. Some might look at psychodynamic theories, exploring those unconscious drives and motivations.
Rooted in his childhood.
Potentially. It's really hard to say. I mean, one thing's for sure. His crimes weren't just random acts. That's clear.
The pattern, the method, it's all there.
And it all suggests a deeper psychological disturbance.
Yeah.
Something more than just, a bad childhood.
We are definitely going deep on this one, which I like. It's important, right? I mean, it's not just about understanding Lorenzo Fayne.
No, not at all. I mean, this is about understanding these broader issues, the cyclical nature of violence,
Yeah.
the impact of societal inequalities, early intervention programs.
Connecting the dots.
Exactly. But before we wander too far down that road, let's come back to Fayne's story. We were talking about his death sentence being commuted, remember?
Oh, right. Big twist. That was huge, wasn't it?
Huge. 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan.
Commuted all death row sentences to life in prison.
All of them. It was a landmark decision. A lot of it was driven by concerns over wrongful convictions.
And racial bias, I read?
Yes, that too, the death penalty being applied unfairly. But really, it reflected a shift in how society was viewing the death penalty itself.
So Fayne's case almost became a symbol.
In a way, yes. Of this larger debate about capital punishment, it forced people to confront those really tough moral and ethical questions.
I'm thinking about it, and it's a prime example of how individual cases, like this one, can trigger massive social change.
Exactly right. And that debate, still going strong today.
Oh, absolutely. Strong opinions on both sides.
People who believe the death penalty is a necessary deterrent, that it's about justice.
Then there are those who see it as cruel and unusual punishment, who question its effectiveness.
Right. And it's a conversation that we as a society need to keep having, even if there aren't easy answers.
Weighing those different perspectives, understanding the consequences of our choices.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Fayne's case, as horrific as it is, it really offers this opportunity to examine these issues, to think critically about the purpose of our justice system, what it's meant to achieve.
And speaking of the justice system, there's more to Fayne's story even after he's behind bars.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about the DNA evidence?
Linking him to Rita Scott's murder.
Back in Milwaukee, years before.
So even though he was already serving multiple life sentences, they kept digging.
They did. And, it highlights something really important about our justice system. Sometimes a case seems closed, but new evidence can pop up.
Leading to new charges.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about closure, for the victims' families.
Can they ever truly move on if a case can be reopened years later?
That's a heavy question, man. I mean, think about the families of Rita Scott, Ari Hunt, all the others.
The pain doesn't just go away.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So while the justice system focuses on, punishment and rehabilitation,
There's this whole other dimension to the story.
the emotional toll on the victims and their families. And that can't be forgotten.
It's like we're on this emotional roller coaster, Up and down, twists and turns.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But it's necessary, I think, to confront those emotions, to acknowledge that human cost. That these aren't just abstract cases.
They're real people, real families whose lives have been shattered.
Exactly. And by understanding that, I think we can get a much clearer picture of this whole thing, the complexities of crime and punishment.
And the ripple effects they have on individuals and whole communities.
Right on. So where do we go from here?
Huh.
We've talked about Fayne's past, his psychology,
The debates his case sparked.
and we've still got so much to unpack.
We do. But before we move on to the next part, I want to pause and give our listeners a chance to think,
Good idea.
what's standing out for you so far? What questions are on your mind as we go deeper into this? Think about it. We'll be back in a minute.
All right, so we've talked about his crimes. We've talked about, what might have led him down this path.
It's psychology, yeah. But now it's like, okay, what happens next? Can someone like Lorenzo Fayne, can they actually be rehabilitated?
Man, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? It's something that people have been grappling with forever.
Philosophers, criminologists.
Everyday folks,
Yeah.
like you and me. It's like, can someone who does something so awful, can they ever really change? To the point where it's safe for them to be part of society again? Hard to say.
Especially with Fayne, with his borderline intellectual disability. Does that make rehabilitation even harder? I'd imagine so.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity for sure. A lot of rehabilitation programs, they use cognitive behavioral therapy, right? CBT.
Trying to change thinking patterns, behaviors.
But when you're dealing with someone who might have trouble with abstract thinking, impulse control,
Like Fayne.
exactly.
Yeah.
Those traditional approaches, they might not be enough, might need to be adjusted.
So it's not like there's this one-size-fits-all solution in rehabilitation. You got to tailor it.
You got it. Figure out what's driving the behavior, address those root causes. For Fayne, you'd be talking about trauma, anger management, teaching him how to build healthy relationships.
Sounds like a long road.
Oh yeah, long and complicated, and there's no guarantee of success.
Which makes you wonder, what does success even look like in a case like this? I mean, is it about making sure he never has a violent thought again? Is that even possible?
A good question. Maybe it's more about reducing the risk,
Yeah.
giving them tools to make better choices, harm reduction.
But how do you even measure that, especially in a prison system that's more about punishment than, well, rehabilitation?
And that's a huge problem. The environment itself can work against you. Violence, isolation, lack of mental health support. It's a recipe for disaster.
Like trying to learn to swim in a pool full of sharks.
Exactly. It's not going to go well. We need to change the system, make rehabilitation a priority, not an afterthought.
So more mental health resources, education, job training.
Creating a culture where people are actually encouraged to grow, to be accountable. That's the key.
But even then, there's the whole issue of public safety. How do you know for sure that someone like Fayne won't, commit another crime if he's released? It's a scary thought.
Scary and tough. There's no crystal ball, Even with all the risk assessments in the world, you can't predict the future. It's about balancing that individual's potential with the safety of the community.
Tough call. And it brings us back to that decision, commuting Fayne's sentence.
Governor Ryan, yeah. Remember, part of his reasoning was the risk of wrongful convictions.
The justice system isn't perfect.
Far from it. But there was also this growing discomfort with the death penalty itself, The idea that we have the right to take a life, even in these extreme cases, it's a heavy moral weight.
So it went beyond just Fayne, really. It was about this bigger conversation.
Absolutely. What is the purpose of prison? Is it revenge? Or is it about giving people a chance to change, to come back to society?
Big questions, and we're still debating them today.
Every day. And Fayne's case, it's a good reminder of how complicated this all is.
It really makes you think. Good and evil, justice, redemption, it's all tangled up in this one story.
No easy answers.
No easy answers at all. Well, we've covered a lot today. Fayne's life, the justice system, this whole idea of rehabilitation. But as always, this is just the start, right?
It is. It's up to each of us to keep learning, keep asking questions. This case, it raises so many important issues, and those conversations need to continue.
So true. This deep dive, it might be over for now, but I hope it leaves you with more questions than answers. Keep digging, keep exploring, and thanks for listening.